Hello, welcome to part two, where we're going to be talking about city-states today and in the future. And I'm joined with Hugo, and I'm Josh.
Right. So we talked about yesterday about some city-states and the concept of the city-state and its history in Europe. And so today we'll look at the possibility of a world of nation-state of city-states, let's say, because that might be quite interesting, kind of to speculate a bit about the future and about the possibilities. And so we'll get into two things. One will be why we should want this and why that could be desirable, and so that's an important thing to kind of establish.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we've talked about why, we will talk about the how, and so how it could be possible to make this change real, to make this change to the international system as we know it, or the state of the world right now. And so everyone today is kind of familiar with these stories of Singapore and Hong Kong and these kind of modern examples of what could be called a city-state. And the histories are usually something like, okay, it was a backwater somewhere, it was a fishing bay or whatever, and then it through kind of good governance, good policies, it became this global hub of innovation and of wealth and of kind of a lot of good things that we often like in a civilization, right? And so if we look at those, a lot of people have been asking the question how to kind of emulate that, how to make that happen more, how to make that kind of innovation and development happen in a nation state or in another political structure than just kind of these small city states. And that's been a difficult question, to be honest. Like you can't just take something that works on like a small scale and apply that to something else where there's different people, different amounts of people and different dynamics in that kind of civilization.
I can definitely see a greater rationale for being a city-state in the past because of the logistical limitations of having a large disparate empire. And I think this is something that the Roman Empire ran into, where they grew so large that governing it was simply impossible, which led to them dividing it in half and then dividing it further and leading to its eventual collapse, although that was among many other factors as well, but just one of many. And I can see it being the case today where we've got all the technology to stay well connected and be well supplied, and these issues aren't nearly as prominent as they used to be, and therefore you could have a state be much larger than it otherwise would have been in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the case that it's much easier right now for states and governments to keep their stuff together and to not lose part of their dominions because of kind of just not being able to reach them properly, right? That's not going to happen today just because of the technology. But then you can have other reasons for wanting to have small political units rather than huge states, right? So even though in history it might have been for different reasons, today those reasons that you'd want these small political units might be the results that you will get through them, which wasn't the case in the past. In the past, it could have been geography, could have been a specific political situation. So geography would be in Greece, specific political situation would be in the whole Roman Empire. And so in the past, it had some causes, but it produced something that wasn't foreseen. But now it could be the other way around. You could say, okay, we want these outcomes, so we're going to do this, even though we don't care about geography anymore that much.
What I can kind of see in contrasting the past and the present or future is that in the past it seemed to be more practically based that these city-states develop, whereas in the future it might be more driven by things that are ideological, in that there might be some new understanding of human nature that perhaps the city-state is more optimal to how our brains work. I'm not proposing that's the case, but I mean anything is possible.
I think that might be that's definitely outside of what I was considering, right? Because what I was considering was this kind of like political question, question of of independence and of self-governance, right? And so if you have of kind of sovereignty, if you want to have a high degree of control over what's happening with you and around you, or with your like community, you have a much like there's much higher chances of you having that in a small political unit where the center of power isn't far away, and where you're not forced into centralized decisions with millions of other people, right? Or like billions even.
I think that's part of the rationale for the US kind of state model, in that they've got these individual states that have their own powers to govern themselves to a certain extent, but there's still kind of the federal control dealing with some varying degree of policies, which kind of changes as time goes on.
Yeah. So if we take a look at the why, then like we've been talking about that a little bit, but like something more specific. So if we look at history, which we done yesterday, we see that city-states have been kind of centers of wealth and culture within their respective civilizations or their societies. And so that's kind of interesting. So why is that? Because I think it's because the competitive pressures on governance. I touched on that a little bit yesterday, which is that people can leave more easily. People can choose more easily between one government and another government. And so if they can do that, that puts the pressure on those governments to be more kind of to be better, right? To fulfill more wishes, to do more good things and do less bad things, do fewer things that people don't want or that outright oppress people, right? And so that's kind of this pressure is something that is there, even though it's something that you don't have to acknowledge publicly or openly, but it's something that forces you to act in a certain way, even if you don't necessarily want to.
Sure.
Which is, so it means that even if you have rulers that are not nice people, they will be forced to do nice things to an extent, or nicer, just because you can simply leave, or you can leave more easily than otherwise. If they can do whatever they want with you, and you can't escape from that, then there's nothing stopping them other than their own conscience, which you can't rely on exactly, can you?
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. And so that if you have these small units, the government needs to be more accountable, and will be less oppressive, because he needs to keep people interested. It's all about the exit costs, right? The cost of taking your stuff and moving elsewhere. It's very hard if you have thousands of miles in each direction, and if you go outside of those boundaries, there's different culture, different language, different everything. You can't just like do that easily. There's the things that are the factors that are keeping you in place will be so strong that you're gonna tolerate a lot of bad things happening to you, even though why should you? That shouldn't be the case, right?
The thing that jumps to mind is Russia, both under the Tsar and under communism. They kind of couldn't escape, and therefore the Tsar or the communists could do whatever they wished to their citizens, which resulted in catastrophe by anyone's measure. Yeah.
But it's not like that. It's true to a large extent in any large country, right? If you're living in the middle of it, and it's the only country in the world, or one of the few countries that speak the same language, that have broadly the same culture, and it's a long way to go to home. Like if you want to visit or something, it's like
that's a limitation that's far beyond the control of the ruling class. And
so then you'll have Russia as the extreme example of this, where it's very visible what's going on, but then the same things, same pressures are there even in today's like democratic, nicer societies, right? And so that's kind of an important thing, like why we should want that, right? And so let's look at the world now. So there are about 200 states in the world right now, and so imagine that you had 10,000, right, instead of the 200, and imagine how much innovation in government and in politics you would have if you had those 10,000 instead of the 200, just because of those competitive pressures among them, right? So that kind of innovation in government and in politics leads to the general rise in the quality of life. Like that's pretty much undisputable, because it's been it's been pretty well established that poor places are poor largely, like not because of exploitation of like the West or anything like that, like these popular theories today, but because of bad politics. Like you can refer to Asimoglu and Robinson, Why Nations Fail. Like that's the classic book that talks about this, talks about political institutions in different countries, why some of them are extractive and some of them are, and if they are extractive, then this is something that will keep your nation, keep your political structure.
This brings to mind one of our previous weekend podcasts about sub-Saharan Africa and how the socialist rulers took a situation where they actually had lots of a wealth of natural resources and good climate, and through poor governance they messed it up and caused famines.
Yeah, I mean, and often having natural resources, it doesn't help you in any way, right? It sometimes it can even lead to you being less successful than if you had nothing, because then you'll have conflicts over those resources.
Sure.
And instead of focusing on building real wealth, which is through what people can do with whatever is around them, right? And through people's kind of abilities and innovation, technology, and things like that, right? And entrepreneurship. And so this is this is kind of like well established that you need good politics, you need good political institutions to be able to rise from poverty, and what keeps you in poverty is bad politics and bad political institutions. And so now in today's world of 200 nation states, you have very little innovation in government, and that's because there's just a few of them and the exit costs are high. So you've got only a few kind of small states, you have multiple very large states, and 200 throughout the whole world is just a very small number.
What do you mean by the exit cost in this circumstance?
I mean that, like, if you're living in like rural Kazakhstan right now, the exit costs are quite high, which means what we talked about before. If you want to kind of protest against the politics of your state, what you can do is kind of raise your voice and try to like do demonstrations and stuff, but it rarely works. So what you can do is to take the stuff and leave elsewhere, but it's very hard to do if it's 500 miles away from where you live, and if you don't know anyone there, if people speak different language, if there is very little in common between like your country, which is very large, and the other countries around it, which are very large as well, but they are very different from your own, right?
So it seems like it would be a huge risk to do that in the modern day, at the very least.
Yeah, like one thing is the risk, and the other thing is the cost. Like you have your you're established somewhere, you have your friends, you have your family, you have all your life, and so it's like moving somewhere far away to something that is really foreign. That's a very hard thing for most people to do, right?
Sure.
And so if you had instead of one Kazakhstan, if you had like 200 political units in the area where Kazakhstan is now, it would be much easier to do. Like, speaking the same language, if you moved like 10 miles somewhere else, you'd be part of a different political unit or under a different government. So you'd have you could vote with your feet much more easily.
This is probably a really basic point, but haven't the kind of 200 nation states arose just simply from the fact that it's enough that we can kind of understand? I'm not sure what I'm trying to say here, but it's enough that you can bear in mind all of the different countries, whereas if there were tens of thousands of different countries, there's no way that you're going to be able to comprehend both the names, the geography, the differences in rule. It's going to be very overwhelming to the individual to understand that.
That might be true, but that being said, like today you have in most countries, in almost all countries, you have some level of local governments. So you have a town, and that like take care of local things. So you want a park there, you want lampposts here, right? And they do this kind of stuff. And so if you go to a town, you might never heard of the name. There might be a government there that does some things. You don't know what they do. You don't know, like you've never heard of the town before you came in, and so you don't need to. Like, why would you, right? And so if you only really you are only really ever interested in stuff that kind of relates to you in some way, right? And so if you're living in a political structure that's huge, if you're living in the US, you're gonna need to worry about the presidential election because it affects you, because the president can do things that affect your life. But if you're living, if you have a small town where the politics of what's happening in the town over don't affect you, then you don't care about the politics in that town over there because you live here, and that's where your life kind of is based. And you might care about that for because you might be interested in it, but it's not important, right? So in the same way that you don't know the local municipalities of Romania, you don't know you wouldn't know the states within the area that is Kazakhstan now.
Sure, but I can still point to Kazakhstan on a map and say that's Kazakhstan. And if you divide it into lots of states, well, I'm not even gonna know where to start. I'm gonna be like, well, this is where Kazakhstan used to be, but all of these other states, I mean, I have no idea. I can't make heads or tails of it. Like,
sure, but like you can point to the map and say this is the Balkans, and there's like 10 states there. This is Iberia, Spain and Portugal.
That's a fair point, actually. Like we've already got pre-existing names for these areas, like Asia Minor for Turkey,
Scandinavia.
So I see what you're getting at now. Like I was thinking about it more from like if I were to go like traveling somewhere, it would be a bit of a nightmare to kind of make heads or tails of where I am, where I'm going. And also the fact that if these individual city-states were, in the tens of thousands, how would, say, the borders work? Because if you're just traveling through Europe, say, maybe you're going through like 100 to 200 different borders. If they all had kind of an Australian-style point system where you've got to apply for a visa ahead of time, it would be a nightmare. So that... I think obviously that's something that could be reconciled by saying, okay, you apply for it in this geographical area and you don't necessarily have to apply for the individual states itself. That might be one way of circumventing it, but it seems like a very practical limitation of this idea.
Yeah, and this is really interesting because you can kind of brainstorm. You don't know what the solutions would be if we woke up in a world with 10,000 states. We don't know what these kind of border arrangements and travel would look like exactly. But we can brainstorm some ideas. And so in that world, like, it's not static. You have like countries that change their policies based on what people want or don't want, and even more so when you have more of them, so there's competition. And then you have entrepreneurs that come up with certain things that kind of help people get what they want. And so you can, based on those, you can kind of brainstorm the solutions to these problems and whatever. I mean, you can say, okay, you're not really worried about people like traveling for tourism, but you want to control someone like moving over there and staying there, so that like treated differently. Okay, fine. Then if you like, even if you have a points-based system for immigration, you don't really necessarily have that for travel, because you don't need that. Why would you have that, right?
Sure.
And so if you wanted to travel from here to the other side of Europe through 200 states, you wouldn't really notice, because they would probably say, okay, like this is the train line, so yeah, this is the train line that goes through our territory, but like that doesn't really matter. So like you can travel
as long as you're not getting off, then it doesn't really matter.
And so if you if you exit the train and go through the gate where you beep your ticket, then that lets them know that you're here, that you've arrived, and that should take that into consideration. Someone, right? And so that's one thing, right? And then you can brainstorm these things to infinity, right? And so that's what entrepreneurship is for. So
sure.
if you say, so you can always say that, yeah, like I can imagine the situation, and it might be difficult to do this and that, but that's what entrepreneurs will say as well. Okay, this is difficult. People need to solve this, and so we're gonna come up with a practical way to overcome this, right? And that's in the interest of the people traveling, but that's also in the interest of the states there, because they want people to come in to spend their money there and raise the GDP. And so this is kind of an emergent system that comes up with solutions very, very
Sure.
easily. And of course, there might be exceptions that, like, somewhere it might be very hard to get to. But I mean, okay, it's very hard to get to North Korea now, and just like no one takes it seriously. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Callum. Another kind of potential thing that I thought might be a limitation of having lots of disparate city-states would be that it might play off human psychology and the kind of in-group, out-group thing, and potentially lead to more conflict. So part of the idea of a nation-state is that you're all equal under the law, and therefore the distinctions between people living within that state are less, whereas if you broke it up into lots of disparate parts, you could see in cases like Italy, where there's a big north-south divide, there may be some cause of conflict there because lots of the wealth is situated in the north and the south is relatively poor. And you could see that if you split that up and ceased its kind of national view, would it not play off of that in-group, out-group? And they would see in the south, well, we're very poor, whereas the north is very rich. We used to be a nation. They've taken advantage of us. Not necessarily to say that that's actually true, but these are the kind of excuses they might make.
So there's two things like in relation to this. Excuse me. So one thing is that these kinds of things play out in today's world as well. I mean, most of strongmen or wannabe dictators in countries, what they do is say, okay, we're here in the as the nation, and this other group of people is oppressing us, is doing something bad to us, so we're going to be antagonistic towards them, right? So this kind of provocation is happening all around us every day. I mean, just it's pointless to a large extent, but this is what you can do very easily in this kind of nation state system, where you have this nation community that is one thing, and you can very easily say, okay, we're the good guys and those are the bad guys, right? So that happens now and happens quite often, and sometimes it leads to wars and sometimes it doesn't lead to wars, and there's kind of different ways to mitigate that risk and to make sure that war is very unlikely to happen, and sometimes it does, but when it does, it's a confluence of other circumstances as well. Sure. Right? And so one of those is that if you need to pay for, if someone asked you to pay for war yourself, you wouldn't, and basically no one would, because why would you? You'd rather buy a TV than pay for war, right? So that's, even if people are very agitated, they're usually not that agitated with their money, and so the fact that now it's governments that pay for war through like having seized like people's taxes and involuntarily, and then they have a pile of money which they can do whatever they want with, then that kind of that puts you in a very risky position.
I see the point you're trying to make, where if the government were smaller, you'd be able to see where your tax money is going. Yeah. And whereas when it's on a larger scale with far more people, it may be a bit more abstract, and the kind of trail that your tax money goes may be less clear to you, and therefore it might be easier for governments to spend it on things that you might not otherwise want.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of idea of when the government is closer to you, you have much more say over what it does, right? And you have and that causes the government to do much more of what you want, and you don't want to pay for war, and you pay if that kind of small tiny government wages war, you pay for it. But if the nation state pays for a war, you pay for it as well. But you don't really get to have a say over that if you're in that big nation state, because it's huge, and there's multiple steps, multiple levels of separation between you and the person that decides on your money and what to do with it, right? And so the closer those things are together, the source of the money and the decision-making power over what to do with it, the more accountable to you it's going to be, and the more closer it's going to resemble something that you want, and you don't want to pay for war because you'd rather want a TV, right? So
depends. Depends what's on TV.
Yes, and so that's kind of the principle that it's important to keep in mind, that factor is there, that would keep a lot of the conflicts just rhetorical and not hot, because people like to boast, but they don't like to lose their money. Right. And so let's get back to the why. We've talked about some of the things, but it's nice to kind of illustrate what the potential of these small units or the alternative governance structures are. So this is just one example. This is Dubai in 1990, and in 2017, it's part of Dubai that's gonna. It wasn't completely like that in the 1990s. There's a town that was there like back there, and so the center of everything is going on in Dubai is in a different place than it was before. So, but this is the same spot. So
yeah, the kind of idea is that the development was very rapid from the 1990s to the modern day, and I'm guessing that's largely due to oil money. I don't know exactly, but I think that's how they've invested it into like a tourist style.
It's very much due to oil money, but then you don't get oil money just by itself. Iran has a large oil, one of the largest on earth oil base in their country, and then Venezuela has as well, right? And so that's the largest known reserves of oil on earth are Venezuela.
Haven't they run out recently? Isn't that why I might be misunderstanding.
No, they didn't run out. They just lost their kind of technology to tap into it.
Okay, so they've lost the infrastructure to actually access it. I thought that they'd actually just wildly over predicted how much oil they had, and then they ran out, and that's what's caused all the chaos.
No, I haven't heard about that. No,
I'm probably just misremembering, to be honest.
But yeah, so what Dubai did was it took over British common law and that kind of structure of solving disputes, and it adapted it for innovation and for investment, right? And so the specifics, I'm not going to get into specifics, but that's the gist of it. And so just by picking your own legal system and doing it consciously, saying, okay, we want this and that, and this is going to lead to prosperity. And if you do it right, that's what it looks like. Of course, you might say, okay, I don't want to live there, but some people do. Some people do, some people don't. Some people imagine progress in a different way. That's fine. So that's why you don't want one Dubai, but you want 5,000 Dubais, because then it might look like a nice rural village because people want it that way, right? Sure. But it's going to be a clean village without crime and like well kept, right? And so that's the point. And so that's kind of the why, like why we'd want that, right? So I've advocated for this kind of for this compelling vision of competition in governance leading to you getting more of what you want. And so let's get into the how. So I picked city-states to talk about primarily because that concept is very easy to integrate within today's international system. So the way that today's international system works is that you have the UN, and if you want your state to have any kind of legitimacy, any kind of serious position, you need to be in the UN, and then so you need to be in the UN, and you need to be recognized by a lot of other states. And then, so to do that, you need to do several things. Often what is taken as kind of the benchmark is the Montevideo Convention and the Montevideo criteria of statehood, which are to have a territory, to have a population, to have a government, and to have capacity to enter into international relations. Right, and so these things are just the basis of your state. And if you have those, you fulfill the kind of objective criteria, and then there's some other things that you can kind of fulfill more or less easily, but this is the gist of it. And so if you take the city state as we've talked about it, this has all of these things, and that's fine. That's not a problem. You can have some other governance models that might have that problem, like the concept of the Ummah, of the Islamic kind of civilization, right? that's a if you wanted to have that as a state, that's a problem, because it doesn't have a fixed population and fixed territory. It doesn't have a fixed government. It doesn't have a structure that could represent it in international relations, right? So that's where that's something that if you wanted to make it into a proper state, that would be very difficult for you in that current form. Same thing with the in the guilds in the Middle Ages that we talked about, the Hanseatic League, for example. That wasn't really a political unit that much. To a certain extent it was. It had some kind of the characteristics, but then it was also, in some reaches of its influence, it was also a part of town somewhere, a few city blocks that were kind of part of this confederation, but not their surrounding city. The population was like, it was members of the guild, but there was also civilians who took part of it. There was external merchants.
It wasn't distinct enough.
Yeah, and so these different models are not that compatible with today's international system, but the city-state is. So you have these kind of basic criteria fulfilled. That's okay, and so if the form is okay, if you can do it easily, then the problem is just about creating those jurisdictions. So you have 200 odd states now, and so you need to make them, and they cover the whole planet except for Antarctica and some shit. And so you need to make them kind of give up parts of their territory to make room for others, right? If you want more of them. And so that might be the hardest problem, but that might also be not insurmountable, because you have a couple of options. First important thing to consider is that in most states, the biggest city is you have the biggest city that is the capital, that is the center of power in that state, and that is that central of influence in that particular society, right? And so if you convince kind of the people in that city that it would be more beneficial for them to separate themselves from the countryside, that might be something that could be viable. And that sounds quite drastic, but at the same time, like, why not? Because right now you have the main political rift between people being clearly urban and rural, right? If you look at how people vote, what they do, what their priorities are, what their lifestyles are, like this is the main thing. It's not about who is black or white or whatever, or like men or women. Like that's might be some differences, but those differences are tiny compared to the differences between the rural and the urban, right?
Yeah.
And so if this is the major thing, if this is the most important kind of divide, then it makes sense to kind of not force all of this together, and to let everyone go their own way, right? And so you can convince those population centers that it makes sense for them to separate themselves and not keep the countryside or the rest of the country on board, just because they want different things, right? So the progressives and the lefties in the cities could be persuaded that dragging the rural rednecks like behind you can like only slows you down and makes the progress that you want more difficult, right? And so if you put it like that, it's like, okay, there's something that you want, but there's people out there who are making it difficult for you. So why don't you want to separate if you have all that power, if you're the center of power and influence in that situation, right? And so if you bring this idea to people, it might be kind of easy to convince them, okay, that does make sense. I want to do my thing. So why would I need to drag these people into it? They don't want to, if I can just choose to separate because I'm the more powerful one in that kind of relationship.
I get what you're saying, but I think that more often than not, it's not as discrete as just you have these rural and urban, or that there's a fair amount of exchange between the two. Like, just thinking of myself, where I grew up in kind of a mixture of both. I was kind of on the edge of a major city, but I was very close to being rural at the same time, and I kind of had the best of both. Right. I had easy access to a major city, but also I was very close to the countryside. I could go for a walk and be in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by farmers' fields, but if I go in the other direction, I could be in the city centre of a population of like 300,000. So it would be very difficult to actually draw these fault lines in a practical sense. But I understand the point you're trying to make, that there's a very different political attitude between people who live in rural areas and people who live in urban areas, and you can see that in voting behaviour in pretty much any country. It's not necessarily something that's specific to Europe or North America. You can see it anywhere where you're typically going to get more progressive policies in more densely populated areas and more conservative policies in less populated areas. And that seems to be true of pretty much everywhere. I'm sure there are probably some exceptions, but it seems like a relatively universal law.
So what is important to stress here is that I'm not necessarily talking about like building a wall on the like, between a city and the countryside. Like that's no point. Like that's not what I mean, right? So it's sometimes it's difficult for people from the UK or even from the US to imagine that for different reasons. To imagine kind of soft borders like that, right? Because for the UK it's an island, right? It's like mostly an island. So it's like for most people, this is my country, and so there's the sea and there's other countries, right? And for the US, it's like, okay, this whole vast thing is my country, and then okay, if I want to go to a different country that most people in the US like don't do that, don't even have a passport, because like, why would you do that, right? You have almost all climates in the US. You have all like there's so much diversity of everything in the US just within those borders that most people don't really feel the need to visit outside even, right?
Sure.
And so thinking about like regularly moving or kind of traveling between different countries, kind of being in that more international space is something quite foreign to both people in the UK and people in the US, right? But if you're from Europe, mainland Europe, that's something. It's a bit different because the countries are much smaller, but also there's no sea. So you have often those borders are more porous. I don't necessarily mean migration. That's a different issue, but more like traveling and like practical stuff, right? And so if you're kind of crossing a field, you might cross a country border. You might not even know about it in large parts of Europe, just because it's that way, and it works well that way, to be honest. So that's what I'm talking about. If you want to create new political units or kind of reshuffle the political units that you have, you don't need to create kind of barriers or any like large gaps between the one thing and the other. It's just a conceptual separation between like one political unit and the other, but in practical terms of like traveling or whatever, doing stuff, it doesn't really have too much of an impact on you as a person that is just like going around here and there. Right?
It's not surprising that in the EU they have the freedom of movement between different states, because they have this kind of attitude, and given that, it's not surprising that the UK would be the first to leave, considering it's an island and it doesn't have it. There's not the same cultural attitude towards borders that you might have on continental Europe, like as you were saying.
But even outside of the Schengen area, right? The Schengen area is the most pronounced in this. But outside of the Schengen area, but within the EU, for example, you can still like travel freely if you want without visas, which you can do with most countries in the world. It doesn't matter really, and you can just travel there. And what they will do is just like there's a border check, right? They'll just check your passport. They'll just do okay. Yeah, done, go, right? And that's it. It just takes 5 seconds, and you don't even have to have that. But even that is the restrictive area, right? That is the restrictive border, and so again, entrepreneurship comes into this. You can have hundreds of ways of like dealing with the border crossings like this. It's not something that would be that would need to be so strong and so kind of distinctive as it now. You have a moat, you have a wall. It's just like this is just very strange.
Because I would imagine if you like a situation where you live outside of like London and you commute like 2 hours, as many people do, because the cost of living in London is ridiculous. And they would have to go through like several passport checks.
Of course. Yeah, but so that's not what I mean at all. Like this is ridiculous. So we talked about how if they separated, they could have their own policies, right? and they could more easily achieve what they actually want. And so the flip side of that is that the outward competitive pressures, because of all these different units that we talked about, would force some of them to face the realities of their policies, right? So if someone had kind of worse policies than the other, it would produce bad consequences. They would be more immediate than they are now, when, say, states are big and things are just moving around and it's not clear what produces what.
Yeah, the cause and effect is harder to differentiate when it's at a national level, just because the geography is different around the nation, therefore it's going to affect people in different ways. And obviously not just the geography, but just the different areas of a nation are going to have different situations, but which seems really obvious to say, but more often than not, national policies don't always apply equally.
So let's take a hypothetical example, of a state, of a city-state that could separate from its existing country, London. This is something that's been a meme for some time, but London absolutely dominates the UK in terms of kind of power and politics and influence. It's not the majority of the UK, but it's by far the largest player and power center, right? So that's what I mean. And so its population is larger than half of European countries now, so that's not an issue, right? So something that would be okay, we're too small. Size is okay. This is the comparison between London and Hong Kong. So London is bigger than Hong Kong, double roughly, or something like that, looks like. And so that's not an issue, right? So all the kind of practical things are there, fine, So just there wouldn't be anything substantial like that would be an hindrance to it. So there could be something that would be fun to observe.
Well, it's funny you say that, because there's been a distinction in politics for a long time between London and the rest of the UK, and
that's why I picked that.
Yeah, it is a good example, because even just me visiting London, I'm not from London, and it feels very different from the rest of the UK. It
does.
It's got a very different atmosphere. It's very difficult to put in objective terms, but it feels very separate from the rest of the UK. Whereas you could be pretty much anywhere outside of London if you're kind of dropped in the middle of nowhere, and it more or less looks the same, feels the same, and things work more or less the same. And you go to London and everything's very different. Even just the subway system was kind of wow, this is pretty complicated. I can't get my head around it. That's more probably a comment on me than anything to do with London.
But yeah, so that is the point, right? If you see this kind of divide, there's no point forcing people together to make all or nothing decisions. You know? One size fits all solutions. That's pointless, So why do that? If there's no why stress over it so much? Why produce so many conflicts between those different types of people? If they clearly want different things, why can't you have both? You can have both by becoming independent.
And also, in the case of London, I know there are lots of financial institutions there that kind of pressure us to keep a very low rate of business tax. And I'm not necessarily saying that's neither good nor bad. I mean, make your own minds up. But we make lots of special exceptions for London-based businesses that don't necessarily have to hold true outside of London.
Right.
And
yeah, I mean, you don't have that kind of problem, right? But continue. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
So yeah, we've got policies that seem to accommodate these businesses in a form of almost tax haven in London, particularly for asset management and kind of investment funds and things like that, where the wealthy come to London and hand over their money to be managed by a financial institution, and therefore, because our economy is very dependent on this, we've got to make sure we don't damage this industry. But kind of by the same token, in instituting policies that have to accommodate for that, it seems like outside businesses are losing focus, because this is such a large part of our economy.
Yeah, I mean, and if you have different things with different interests and different goals, there's no real reason to have the same policies for that, because like as I said, what's the point? Like why? Like that's only going to produce like something that you don't want, like outcomes that you don't want, plus tensions between people and groups of people. So it's just pointless.
Although I don't feel any tension towards people from London. Don't worry. If you're from London, you're perfectly fine.
So right. So I'm just going to go quickly over the other option because we don't have that much time anymore. But
Sure.
The other option is just building things from scratch. So taking a green field and building your city on top of it, and then just saying, okay, like this is a city state now. This is its own thing, and projects like this are already in existence, and they are aiming at having concessions from existing states to have some kind of limited autonomy. And the drawback of this is that the autonomy is always limited in some way. It's not complete. You have to pay some kind of tribute to the state. You have some policies that are still imposed upon you even if you don't want them. So it's not that great. The advantage of it is that it's absolutely consensual from the start. If you start on a green field, you start with zero population, so everyone who wants to join joins afterwards. So you don't force anything on anyone, which is a bit different than if you did that like with London. Some people would vote against it, and they would be ignored. Sadly, but that's how democracy works. So that's a drawback of it, right? And so that's an advantage of this kind of greenfield projects. And so these might be like special economic zones that have become kind of ubiquitous over the last decades, which have slightly different policies like for economic development than their mother states. And then recently there's been a development in Honduras about these zone for employment and economic development kind of thing, which is a special case of these special economic zones, which is tailored more towards kind of this kind of prosperity zones, whatever, building some kind of this kind of Dubai model things, right? And so then you have some more ambitious future developments, which could be something like free private cities, which is a concept of a fully privatized city with the same kind of with the services that are provided by the government not being absent in some way, but provided in different ways by different private companies, and about like dealing things in that kind of sphere other than through governments as we know them. So that's one concept that is out there. And another thing is seasteading, which is basically colonization of the oceans and creating separate jurisdictions or city-states there that are kind of highly mobile. It's quite fun to kind of explore this kind of things.
Sounds like the BioShock games, building a city under the sea,
yeah,
free from any rule of government.
Yes, so like this reimagining civilization with floating cities, right? So this is kind of the idea of you having your separate jurisdictions separate from states on land, and also those. It's not like you had a whole city, but different parts of the city, different modules that could connect and disconnect however they wanted. So you could like form and reform different structures to allow for that kind of fluid governance based on who wants what. It
sounds very grassroots in terms of politics. It's all very bottom up rather than top down.
And so I'm not saying this is all something that's happening like now and that's viable now, but it's something that people have been thinking about, and it's fun to imagine these possibilities, right? And so then you have kind of a special case, which is Liberland, which is an interesting result of a border dispute between Croatia and Serbia. So there's a map. On the map you can see you have the Danube River in the middle, and then you have the border between Croatia on the left and Serbia on the right. And the border is like that because the Danube used to be like that, but it's a river. It changes its shape over time, right?
Okay.
And so now it's like that, but it used to be like that. And now both sides claim that the border is somewhere else because that is beneficial for them. So Croatia is claiming that the border is where it was originally drawn, where the Danube originally was, and Serbia is claiming that it is where the Danube is at any point, right?
Okay.
And so Serbia is claiming that it is there, and Croatia is claiming that it is there. And what it produces is that these large pockets of greenery that are on the right side of the Danube, they are claimed by both.
Okay.
But by implication, that means that these smaller pockets on the left are not claimed by anyone. And so that pocket in the middle, on the left side of the Danube, that's the place claimed by Liberland, because it's not claimed by either Croatia or Serbia by implication of that dispute. It's kind of interesting.
I didn't know about this.
Yeah.
This is like the original border though looks ridiculous. Like just intuitively from the state of that border, I would be siding on the current position of the Danube, just because it's really aesthetically displeasing to look at that previous border. It looks like it's been scribbled on by a child rather than...
Sure, but if the river was under it, it would feel better.
But it still looks like a very bizarre border nevertheless. But
So,
I don't want to take sides.
so there's a situation that how it came about, and so this is kind of a greenfield project rather than a secession or autonomy effort, but it's also separate from existing states, right? So it's kind of a merge of those two things, those two options that we talked about, and it's kind of it's a legit project, right? It's got a constitution, it's got a website, it's got like major backers, and it has enthusiasts that want to move in. It's got delegations into a lot of existing states that have been trying over a couple of last years to gather support and recognition from other states to this idea of the Liberland. So that's kind of interesting that this is a thing, and it might become actually a thing in the future, because there's nothing there. It's just a forest now.
All right.
Right. So let's just summarize it quickly. So what we've been talking about. So imagine a world where there's loads more of regular states and loads of city states as well. It's not that hard to move. If you want to move into a different jurisdiction, you just need to move tens of miles rather than hundreds or even thousands of miles. So it might be the same language in the neighboring jurisdiction and similar culture. So across some area there might be loads of political units, but very similar kind of environment among them.
Similar to the Holy Roman Empire, where like the German language was in common. There was a shared culture, but they belonged to different states.
Yeah. And a legal system was to a large extent common as well there.
Yeah.
And so you have more options to choose from what you want politically, right? So if you're the kind of person that wants a safe, conservative, unchanging environment, fine, that you can move like 5 miles down the road and have that. If you want a dynamic, ever evolving, and a futuristic landscape, whatever, move 10 miles over there and you have that there, fine. You can have both. You don't have to choose either of them, and you don't have to force what you want and you don't have to take what you want and try to force that through democracy on other people, because you can just do a thing and they can do their thing. It's fine. So what's the flip side, right? The competitive pressures of resulting from that kind of setup would cause governments to become less oppressive, become more attuned to what people want and more responsive to people want, and they would if they became oppressive, they would just lose their popularity, and like that's not viable. That's not how business works, right? And so they would need to actually be effective, or at least more so than they are now. So it's and that kind of competition would also expose ideas and concepts that just don't work, because you wouldn't be able to finance your idea that doesn't work from someone else's pocket, right? And so that's another advantage of it as well. And so the politics of that would be much more consensual, right? There wouldn't be any like shady, vague like social contract that no one actually signed, and they can change it, but you can't change it. This is just like very, very slimy and weird. And so maybe it will have some kind of real accountability rather than what we have now with these huge nation states. And so just a parting tip that I have is this book. It's called Your Next Government by Tom Bell. He's a lawyer and he describes this all in good detail. So I recommend it definitely for anyone who's interested in reading more about this.
Okay, thanks for watching.